our suit jacket sleeve pinned from the fitting with the customer. So we're going to begin by marking this sleeve so that we can measure how much we need to take off. Let's see where we are at. About 1 1/4 is what we're going to shorten the sleeve to. So we're going to begin by taking out any top stitching or decorative stitching and removing all of the buttons so that we can get inside and get to work. So we've released the lining and the hem itself along with any type of decorative stitching or buttonholes. So now we're ready to start marking our new length. We've got our original crease here from where the jacket was, but we know that we need to move it up 1.5 inches. So measuring from that crease, we're going to mark out our new sleeve length, going all the way around, measuring up from that crease. And this is only on the outer sleeve. We will work on the lining after we've shortened the outer. Then we'll come back to our new sleeve length mark and measure down 2 inches. This is the seam allowance we're going to leave. And we're going to mark along there. Perfect. And now we're just going to cut off that extra amount under the seam allowance we marked. We want to save this bit that we cut off for a couple of reasons. We'll use it to mark and measure the lining next, and we'll use it to make sure that we lengthen or shorten the sleeve the exact same amount on the other arm. So the scraps are really important in this case. We want to hold on to them. Great. Alrighty, and then we'll set that aside. So now let's move over to our placket. The button placket here in the opening of the sleeve needs to be mitered on one side and folded up on the other. The folded up edge is relatively simple. We've got our 1.5 inch marks. We'll make one more, or our 2 inch seam allowance, excuse me. And we're going to just fold that section back on itself right there at our mark. You see that? And pin that in place. During this process, we try to pin a few steps at once and then sew. Pin a few steps and sew to make the process more streamlined. On our mitered edge side, we see the crease from the original miter. What we'd like to do is make a parallel line up here where our new hem length is. So we're measuring straight across, but at our new length. So right here, again, we can see the crease right there, and we're coming up parallel and marking a new line there at a 45-degree angle. You see our new line goes straight through our new hem length, but is parallel to this line. Then holding our ruler in place, we're actually going to lift up the edge of that fabric and mark it on the back as well, because that's actually where we're going to be sewing it. Now, we're folding this line on top of itself. You see that? And if we've marked correctly on the reverse side, it should come down right in line. Let's see if it does by putting a pin through and looking on the other side. Perfect. Great. So now we're going to sew this line and the other side of our placket opening straight down, and then we'll flip them and get them ready. As you can see, we've sewn this edge, the non-mitered side of the placket, and I'm going to stick my thumb inside, push the seam allowance over, and flip it to the outside. That keeps that seam allowance smooth and gives us a nice turn. But we've got our point turner, and we're going to give it just a little bit of help on the inside, pushing out the corner of that edge. And as you can see by our blue mark, That puts us right at the length that we measured, so that's perfect. Now we'll move over to the other side where our mitered edge is, which is a little more complicated. We're going to put our thumb on the inside, finger inside of this pocket created by sewing that seam we just pinned, and then push down the seam allowance and flip to the outside. You see? And we can just see the edges of our blue mark that we made, and then there is our finished side. Great. And now we're going to use our point turner again, give it a little bit of help. And this is when the iron is going to become really important. So we're going to press these edges really well, lining them up, getting them straight, and the rest of our cuff. So following the marks that we made earlier, we're going to put a few pins in to hold this in place. Remember, we measured a 2-inch seam allowance, which means we'll have 2 inches on the inside, so that's correct. And now we're going to go ahead and iron all the way around this edge. So we have our ironing board here, and what we're doing is flattening these edges that we just turned for the placket and pressing down our new length all the way around. We're also going to take this opportunity to put a little bit of fusing in between the seam allowance for the new hem, because we want this cuff to stay nice and sharp. On suit jackets in particular, we want this edge to be crisp, and we don't want our lining to start pulling out from the inside. So we're going to give it a little bit of fusible to give it that support. So we have our black and white fusible. In the case of a lighter jacket, we're going to choose the white. So I've cut 2 little sections for myself here, and I'm just going to set them up so that we are ready to slide them in. These pieces will go in between the underarm seam and the placket on either side of that cuff to give it that support, because we'll tack the placket down and we'll tack the underarm seam down. So we'll have 4 points of security all the way around when it's done. We're also going to use our water and spray off these blue marks. We've used them now and gotten to a place where we are ready to spray them off. And now let's get pressing. We're going to use a fair amount of steam to really hold this in place. And our arm board here is going to be really important for giving us exactly the right smooth shape that we're going for. This ironing section of the process cannot be understated. It is extremely important. Ironing at this stage is what will make the final product look beautiful. So we want to carefully move everything into place so that it's just right when we finish. Great. All right. And now we're ready to place that fusible. So again, my underarm seam is here. I'm going to place 1 bit of fusible down in this crease, halfway between the placket and the underarm seam. And press that. Again, on the opposite side, we have the placket, underarm seam, and we're going to put that fusible right in the center. Down in the crease, because we need this seam allowance to reattach the lining later. And holding that in place, slide it onto the board. And a lot of good heat and steam there to make sure that that fusible melts. Good. Perfect. I'm going to give this placket 1 more press before we flip to the inside to make sure it's nice, flat, secure, and also to make sure that it lines up at the edges. We want the under placket to match the mitered edge perfectly along the cuff bottom. That's super important for a nice clean look later. You'll also notice that there's buttonhole stitching from previous. In many cases, we'd like to remove this buttonhole stitching, but these are permanent buttonholes that have already been cut. So unfortunately, we can't move those up. That's all right. It just means that the buttons will be closer to the edge on this particular jacket. Now, let's flip to the inside of the garment. Now that we've flipped the garment inside out, we still aren't getting to the lining. We're going to push the lining up the sleeve and get back to that in a moment. We need to do a few very important tacks on the inside of this sleeve before we continue. So, as you can see, I'm reaching in between our seam allowance and the outer edge of the garment with one finger, and reaching in between the other seam allowance and only grabbing that part in between to place this tack, holding these pieces together, which make up the placket. And let me show you what that looks like from the outside. It means these are held together. But you can't see the stitching from the outside, and you can't see it from the inside. So again, it's a pocket in between this seam allowance and this seam allowance, where we're moving this one out of the way and this one out of the way, and only sewing from there to there. And that is what gives us this. Perfect. Now, we'll press that, give that another good press, and move around to tack the other side, the underarm seam. And we're going to do two things. One, we're going to take this seam allowance and give it a little split, and then tack it just right there so it doesn't continue to split up that seam. The reason we're going to do that is this. This is really important. The jacket sleeve becomes wider as it goes up the arm, which means if we're folding additional fabric up into that sleeve, the longer the jacket sleeve is, the smaller the opening gets. So we're trying to put the smaller opening of the bottom of the sleeve up into a larger section of the sleeve, which means we need that give. We need that little bit of space there for the entire sleeve to be able to sit flat. So we've tacked that in place so it won't continue to creep down that seam. And then finally, we're going to tack our cuff seam allowance down to the seam allowance of the underarm seam. And we're going to do that just by folding this out and holding, that's the crease right there. Let me show you one more time. This crease is where the seam allowance for the cuff and the seam allowance for the underarm sleeve meet. And we're sewing that little stitch there to keep it right in place. You see that? And now, when we reattach the lining later, it can't go further down and come out the end of the sleeve so that you can see it from the outside. So now, everything is secure, and we are ready to adjust the lining, cut it, and reattach it. Now, we're going to open a small hole in the underarm seam of the lining so that we can reach inside and start reattaching the lining. So we're reaching in through this underarm seam, and we're going to pinch the lining together with the underarm seam of the outer sleeve and pull that gently through our hole. Now, lining up those seams, we're going to place a pin. And we know that our seam allowance is 1/2 inch up because we measured that on the lining. So we're gently pulling the outer sleeve and the lining out through that hole and pinning in place. And we're going to do that as far around as we can until we reach the placket. See here, we can just barely see the placket coming through. You see that? And now we'll have to stop sewing here and jump over this little gap to the other side. You see that? So then we'll pick up our pinning again right over here and almost back to where we started. See, as you travel around that edge, once we flip this back out to the right side, this attachment will make a lot of sense. So let's place one more pin, and with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew all the way around that edge now. So as you can see, we've just finished sewing our lining back to our outer sleeve. And when we get to this placket here, you see how we have to stop and jump over that little opening. I'll show you that from the outside, just remember that. So we've made a continuous circle, and now we're going to come back out through that hole in the seam, underarm seam of our lining. There we go. Beautiful. So you see how we had to attach the lining back to the sleeve from the inside to be able to give us that seamless, continuous look. And then when we come over here to the placket, that little hole we left, that's right there where the placket is coming back out and separated. Great. Now, we're going to give that one more press. And then we'll just need to close up that sleeve and get the buttons back on. All right. Now that we've given it a good press, we're just going to tack the lining in one more place to the sleeve. So we're going to reach in one more time and pinch the seam allowance of the lining to the seam allowance of the jacket. And I'm going to pull that out for you to see. So those underarm seams, we're just holding them together, you see, so that the lining doesn't come down that sleeve like we talked about. So we're just pulling that little bit of seam allowance on the lining and little bit of seam allowance on the underarm sleeve. We're going to place one little pin there and give that a tack, and then carefully and cleanly top stitch this hole back together and close it up for good. All right, so we've just chosen a nice matching color to close up that underarm seam in the lining, and we're ready to flip it back out and put those buttons on. So we're going to flip to the outside, and one thing I want to point out are the buttonholes here. So ideally, we would remove the buttonhole stitching in the beginning. Unfortunately, this is permanent and we haven't been able to remove it, which puts our buttonholes very close to the edge of the garment. This would be something that we'd want to discuss with the customer so that they understood that when the buttons went back on, they're going to be very close to that edge. This placement and the fact that we can't move it is something we'll want to mention to the customer. Some may mind, but most won't. It's still something we want to discuss, however. Now, if we weren't bound by the placement of these buttonholes, we would use our button placement card to line up where we wanted to place the buttons by marking straight through these holes. That gives us a good margin on the side and from the bottom. However, as these buttonholes are placed, we will just use the buttonholes that we have. So we're going to take our buttons and our matching colored thread, and we're going to begin from the front, holding the placket together. You can also use a pin here to hold that placket together so that these edges stay aligned as we begin sewing the buttons. We're going to hide our knot on the front, and we really want to make sure that we keep our stitches very close together on the inside because you will be able to see them. So we want them to look as clean as possible. From there, we'll start threading on our buttons. Coming back down, hitting that same spot underneath if possible. And because our buttonholes are so close to the edge of the garment, we're going to try to hold the button so that the edge of the button isn't coming off of the garment itself. That's the best that we can do for the visual look here. We also want to make sure that the thread is clean, we don't have loose loops, and that we've got a nice, tight finish. So we've sewn each of the buttons down in place. They're just barely overlapping, which is the correct placement. Now we're going to knot off at the end of our fourth button here, just by picking up a little thread and tying one little knot and one more just to be sure. And then we'll just run our thread on the inside here to hide that tail. Perfect. Now we've got all 4 buttons sewn on. Let's check the inside and make sure that we grouped our stitches. And we did. We want to keep those stitches nice and tight. And I like to sew all 4 buttons on with the same thread moving up underneath the fabric each time, so that it's one continuous thread, but also so that you don't have to keep knotting off on the inside. It's just simple, easy. The last thing we're going to do is give it one more press and just take a look and make sure there's nothing else that stands out as out of place, like checking for the blue marks and making sure that we spray off any remaining marks or iron off any remaining chalk. Beautiful, nice and flat, and careful not to press directly on top of those buttons. They are often plastic, so we don't want to risk any melting. The last thing we're going to do is measure our new underarm seam length so that we have that before we move on to the other sleeve. And it looks like we're right at 16 1/4. So we're going to write that down and make sure that the other sleeve matches up when it is completed as well. And that wraps up our shortening suit jacket sleeve.